Alright guys, how's it going? As you know, Coffee Lake Paper launched at the end of last week, and it was undoubtedly a paper launch. There are no i7 8700Ks in stock anywhere, and there has never even been any on Amazon, at least not Amazon.com. And over at Anantech, Anton Shilov has an article checking the price and availability. And as you can see, looking on this final column, there is not a single 8700K in stock. Well yeah, apart from these ones at Overclockers UK, costing between £500 and £800, I believe the OC UK got around 30 pieces, and they've de-lidded and binned them all, while marking up the cost dramatically. Those appear to be the only stock of the 8700K worldwide. So if that's not a paper launch, then I don't know what is. Now if you recall, back in my tech update, this was the first time that I actually talked about Coffee Lake, and we saw a benchmark using Cinebench of an HP Omen system which had an 8700K CPU, and it's safe to say that the score wasn't that great, 1230 points. Now at this time, I had not actually been paying a massive amount of attention. I mean, the score looked a little bit off to me, but like I said in the video, it's a pre-built HP. It's going to have the slowest possible RAM in there, and in that video I actually noted that drivers were installing while Cinebench was running, so obviously that would affect the score as well. And then 4 days ago in my Coffee Lake paper launch video, I showed the X preview numbers where they got a Cinebench score of 1262. And I noted there that the Cinebench numbers seem to be a little bit off, only 31% ahead of their 7700K, whereas the other multi-threaded scores were between 40 and 50%. This is more like what you'd expect, because with 50% more cores at around the same speed, you should expect between 40 and 50% faster performance. Now by this stage I'm thinking, well, maybe the Cinebench scores here are not quite right. There's something going on, and there could have been a couple of reasons for that. Now, the reviews landed, and, well, you can see from this chart that some of the scores are dramatically higher than the 1200 type scores of the previous 2 leaks. There's still one there below 1300 at Guru 3D, and there's a couple in the mid 1300s, PCGH and at Anantech. Then you've got a bunch around the low 1400 mark, followed by a few near the mid to high 1500s. That simply does not make sense. Even if you ignore the HP Omen leak, which looked a little bit flawed, the difference between X Preview at 1262 and Hardware Canucks at 1579 Cinebench R15 points, that's a difference of 25% for the same CPU in the same benchmark. And the thing about Cinebench, the reason why I use Cinebench is because it is a very consistent benchmark. There is simply no way that we should be seeing a 25% difference in performance with the same CPU from site to site. So now I'm going to take a look at this and see exactly what is going on here. Right, so I'm going to start off by looking at Intel's Turbo Boost Technology 2.0 webpage. Turbo Boost Technology 2.0 is of course what we have in Coffee Lake and also on the most recent Intel CPUs. But starting off here, Intel Turbo Boost Technology 2.0 accelerates processor and graphics performance for peak loads, automatically allowing processor cores to run faster than the rated operating frequency if they're operating below power, current and temperature specification limits. And whether the processor enters into Intel Turbo Boost Technology 2.0 and the amount of time the processor spends in that state depends on the workload and operating environment. Now, straight off we see here, the maximum turbo frequency indicates the highest possible frequency achievable when conditions allow the processor to enter turbo mode. And due to varying power characteristics, some parts with Intel Turbo Boost Technology 2.0 may not achieve maximum turbo frequencies when running heavy workloads and using multiple cores concurrently. And here we can see what it all depends on: the type of workload, the number of active cores, the estimated current consumption, the estimated power consumption, and also the processor temperature. So that gives us a pretty solid idea of how this works. The numbers that Intel gives us for Turbo Boost technology are the maximum numbers. They will never go higher than that, ever, under any circumstances. And in actual fact, they may go lower depending on all of this stuff. If the CPU is not running under ideal conditions, for example, water cooling or some very good air cooling. And that still depends on the quality of the CPU as well. Now they also have a Turbo Boost technology FAQ, which again explains just about everything I have talked about there. One of the more interesting parts is this turbo boost frequency, and can I see frequency tables for i5, i7 and i7 Extreme? You can click on that and bring up a bunch of charts. So let's just click on this i7 Extreme Edition one. So here we've got the i7 4960X, which would have been the flagship, I believe, I think. Yeah, it would be because it's the X. So that was a 3.6 GHz base clock CPU. with 6 cores. And the interesting part here is this shows us exactly how the turbo works. The number of active cores, if this 6-core CPU has the full 6 cores active, then that means the CPU gets 1 extra bin upside. In other words, 3.6 GHz CPU will operate at 3.7 GHz. And this is exactly the same for 5 cores, 3.7, 4 cores, 3.8, 3 and 2 cores, 3.9, and the 1 core, the single core turbo at 4 GHz. Now, that's not an awful lot of turbo, as you can see. At worst you get 0.1 and at best you get 0.4. Now if we take a look at the i7 desktop processor, this one goes all the way up to Kaby Lake in fact, and we can see here the i7 7700K, which has a base clock of 4.2 GHz. As we know, that is a quad core CPU, and here we can see the active cores and the turbo boost upside. With 4 cores and 2 cores active, instead of running at 4.2, the CPU should run at 4.4. And as we know, the single core turbo is 4.5 GHz. So that's how it works for the 7700K. Now about a month ago over at Tweaktown, this looks like an Intel document which is documenting what we should expect to see for CPUs like the i7 8700K and the i7 8700. A little bit down this chart we can see that the maximum core turbo frequency of a single core is 4.7, for 2 cores it goes to 4.6, for 4 cores active it goes to 4.4, and finally with all 6 cores active it goes to 4.3. Now when I saw this I thought, those numbers are really high. I mean, this is the thing, this is meant to be Intel's desktop platform, not their high-end desktop platform. So the motherboards and the platforms are more limited by TDP than you would expect to see on the high-end desktop, and yet we all remember what happened with Skylake X. You had CPUs like the 7800X consuming tons of power, even though that was a hexa-core with 4 GHz. So when I saw this 4.3 GHz, that does not seem very likely to me. And even though we knew that Intel's process was improving to the new 14++, we can see here in this chart what we can expect. This is Intel's own chart showing how transistor performance has improved since the 2015-14 nanometers. This would be the original Broadwell transistors back in 2015. We can see here that today's 14++ in 2017, in other words Coffee Lake CPUs, should have 26% transistor performance at the same active power, or you can take 52% less power. Now we all know that Broadwell was a little bit odd. We ended up with the i7 5775C, which also came with that large L4 cache, which helped to feed the Iris Pro graphics. But the CPU had a base clock of 3.3 GHz and a turbo of 3.7, and that was a 4-core 8-thread CPU of course. So just by looking at this chart, you should expect 26% higher transistor performance, in other words 26% extra clock speed with the same number of cores and threads at the same power. So it's not exactly difficult to figure out that 6 cores and 12 threads at 4.3 GHz should be consuming an awful lot more power. And that there was basically a roundabout way of me explaining why I did not believe the 4.3 GHz. I found these numbers a little bit hard to swallow, and that also explained to me why the X Preview and even the HP Omen Cinebench numbers were much lower than the expectation. But just looking at that chart again, 25% difference? How can that be possible? Is this all just down to different turbo speeds? That doesn't really seem very likely. I mean, that would be extreme differences in silicon quality for us to see a difference of 25%. But as you'll see now, there's something a little bit different going on here as well. So over at AnandTech, in an article by Ian Cutress 5 years ago, at the end of August in 2012, an article called Multi-Core Enhancement, the Debate About 3 MHz. Now many of you will already know about multi-core enhancement, which is what ASUS call their technology. ASRock call theirs multi-core acceleration, and Gigabyte and MSI have got their own versions of them as well. I can't remember the names of them right now, but here we can again see a chart which Ian has made, again describing how the turbo works. However, here we can see that this technology is not defined by the processor itself, as the act of telling the processor to run at a certain speed is set by the motherboard, not the processor. This should be obvious enough, even though a processor could run at a certain speed. If the motherboard doesn't allow it to run at that speed, then that's how fast the processor will run. So as part of a deal with Intel, motherboard manufacturers code in the BIOS the algorithm to make the CPU switch speeds as required. And then it goes on to talk about this new feature, this new multi-core enhancement feature, which put simply gives the CPU some extra speed. But as you will see, this is not magic. And actually all it does is that once you enable XMP, which is normally used for clocking memory to the correct memory speed, If you select XMP in the BIOS, that is generally what you do to set your memory speed up to its rated speed compared to the stock JDEC speed. You set XMP in the BIOS, and with this new multi-core enhancement thing, the CPU is then told to use the top turbo boost setting under all loads. So in this example here of the i7-3960X, the base speed or the rated speed of that CPU is 3.3 GHz. Under normal circumstances with all 6 cores loaded, it should run at 3.6. But as soon as you set XMP in the BIOS, or nowadays, stuff like this multi-core enhancement is a separate BIOS option which you can turn on or off. But incidentally, this normally defaults to automatic or otherwise on unless it is switched off. With this, rather than the CPU running at its 3.6 GHz all-core turbo, all 6 cores will in fact run at the single-core turbo speeds of 3.9 GHz. So as a result, the user who runs their processor at stock also gets up to 300 MHz more speed during multi-threaded loading. So you might be thinking, that sounds like an overclock, and you'd be right, because technically this is an overclock. Now as usual, AnandTech articles are by far and away ahead of everything else, and this one is very well worth reading, so there will of course be a link to it in the description below. But yes, technically this is an overclock. So in other words, the benchmarks that you see from site to site can be different depending on whether or not this multi-core enhancement thing is either switched on by default or disabled by the reviewer. So going back to this Cinebench R15 multi-threaded chart, where we can see a difference of 25% from the hardware Canucks result to the X preview result. If we also compare the results of the 7700K on these sites, we can see what they got for the difference between the 7700K and the 8700K. Now like I said at the start, this really should be around 40 to 50% because you've got 50% more cores at a slightly less speed. Remember, the 7700K's all-core turbo should be 4.4 GHz, whereas the 8700K's all-core turbo should be 4.3. So in Cinebench, you should be looking at around 45% difference in performance. And what we can see here is that at X Preview and at Guru 3D, and to a lesser extent PC Games hardware, there's a difference below 40%. Looking at AnandTech, TechSpot, Digital Foundry, Pulse Hardware, PC Perspective, and we can see that their 8700Ks are around about that 45% mark ahead of their 7700Ks. So these all look like legitimate scores to me. But when you look at Linus's, Gamers Nexus, and Hardware Canucks, I don't have a 7700K number for Jay, but his numbers would be around the same as these guys that I've just talked about. We can see here that these 4 guys, Linus, Steve at Gamers Nexus, Jay, and SkyMTL at Hardware Canucks, they've all found a difference of almost 60% in their Cinebench R15 multi-threaded scores. And the only way that's possible is by not disabling multi-core enhancement in the BIOS. If you run their 7700K numbers, for example, Hardware Canucks, their 7700K scored 999, which is also the highest. So if we just consider, say, 4 cores multiplied by 4.4 for the 7700K, that gives us 17.6. We'll store that in the memory. And if we then take 6 cores multiplied by 4.7 GHz, that's 28.2. We now need to divide that by the i7 score in memory, and we get around 60%. The difference between the 7700K and 8700K at Hardware Canucks was 58%. You can do this for the rest of them. I'm not gonna bother. I already know that they benchmarked their 8700Ks at 4.7 GHz. And I guess maybe Steve over at Gamers Nexus got a question or two about this, because the day after his Coffee Lake review, he indeed went on to talk about multi-core enhancement. And on rebenching, we can now see that his score was down at 1448, which is a score around about the same as guys like Paul at Pulse Hardware, Steve at TechSpot, and Ryan at PC Perspective. They all got similar scores. And he's finished off by saying, of course, it's better to be off from a benchmark and review standpoint. And this is something that I agree with. However, it's got to be said that the damage is already done, because the benchmarks are out there with the 8700K scoring better than it should be, because it is effectively, technically, overclocked. But I still respect Steve for pointing this out after he'd already done what I consider to be a mistake in his review. Over at Jay's 2 cents, we also saw that he benchmarked at 4.7 GHz. As we can see here, when he started to overclock the CPU, and the ASUS multi-core enhancement is set to auto. In other words, all cores will be synced at 5 GHz. Something a bit different over at Hardware Canucks though, where during the overclocking part of the review, they claimed that their i7 hovered around 4.1 GHz with all its cores loaded. That is simply not true. There is simply no chance that they can score 1579 Cinebench points with this CPU at 4.1 GHz. That is a CPU at 4.7 GHz at least. You might be thinking, well, wait a minute though, you've just gone clock speeds and cores, what about IPC? But it's already been tested, there is no IPC gain. KB Lake was simply Skylake, and Coffee Lake is simply KB Lake with an extra couple of cores. We can see this over at Hardware Unboxed, where Steve compared the 7700K to the 8700K with both at 4.5 GHz and 8 threads. The 7700K is actually a little bit ahead in Cinebench R15, with very similar scores in the Corona benchmark, so there's no IPC gain there, certainly nothing that would explain a score of 1579 at 4.1 GHz. So that's why those high scores are the way they are. But what about the lower ones? You get guys like Guru of 3D, PCGH and AnandTech maybe scoring just a little bit below the average? And the reason there could simply be down to the quality of the silicon. Remember, 4.3 GHz is the maximum turbo frequency when all 6 cores are loaded on the 8700K. And it depends on all that stuff. So if these guys got a CPU that maybe wasn't quite so good quality, then all it would take is that those CPUs would run at 4.1 or 4.2 GHz instead of the 4.3 or the 4.7, and that would cause them to score less than the average. You may have noticed though that this one on the HP Omen, X Preview, Guru of 3D, even PC Games Hardware, I believe that none of these guys got their CPUs directly from Intel, whereas the other guys did. So that could well be something worth thinking about. And in actual fact, this is where this gets pretty interesting, because I don't like the way that this is going. So we're over at AnandTech again, and Ian's i7-8700K and i5-8400 review. And scrolling down to the bottom of the first page, and it talks about turbo modes once again. But one of the interesting things to come out of their briefing with Intel was the fact that Intel made a very clear change in policy when it comes to press disclosure. When the question was asked about per core turbo values for each of the CPUs, Intel made a clear statement first, then a secondary one when quizzed further. First of all, Intel will no longer provide this information. And then after being quizzed on that, we are only including processor frequencies for base and single core turbo in our materials going forward. And the reasoning is that turbo frequencies are opportunistic. As we already know, we know that turbo is opportunistic. It depends on all this stuff. So turbo frequencies are opportunistic given their dependency on system configuration and workloads. Now, as Ian said, this change in policy is somewhat concerning and completely unnecessary, because the information could be easily obtained by actually having the processors and probing the required P-states, assuming the motherboard manufacturer does not play silly tricks. So this comes across as Intel withholding information for arbitrary reasons. They were able to find the per core turbos anyway, and as you can see, the numbers were what we saw over at Tweaktown's article. 4.7 single core turbo going down to 4.3 all core turbo on the 8700K. Now, one thing to note though was the i5-8400, it is shipped with a very low base frequency of only 2.8 GHz, but the all core turbo is 3.8 GHz. A difference of 1 GHz between the base and the all-core turbo? That is unheard of. And Ian speculates that shipping with such a low base frequency is perhaps masking the performance of this part, as it should on paper at least only be a whisker or two behind the i5-8600K. I believe Ian is right in saying that they are masking the performance of this part, but what I believe Intel is masking is the low performance of the average of these parts. Why have a base frequency of 2.8 GHz, yet an all-core turbo of 3.8? In previous videos you see me talking about silicon and how each chip is different. There are no two chips are the same. The power and the performance characteristics of every single CPU are different, but generally speaking they're not massive differences. Generally speaking that is, but it now looks like things have changed. You see, Intel no longer providing this information and now only giving base and single core turbo in their materials leads me to believe that they're hiding something. Here's the thing, right? On a single core turbo, if we take the i7-8700K, that 4.7 GHz single core turbo, running on that one core at 4.7 GHz, the power usage is much lower than it is when the CPU runs 6 cores at 4.3 GHz. Similarly, this i5-8400 and its single core turbo of 4 GHz, absolutely no problem whatsoever for any Intel CPU to run 4 GHz on a single core, while remaining well within its TDP value. But 6 cores at 3.8 GHz under 65 watts? Remember what I talked about the 7800X and the very high power draw of that part. Now we're looking at the Coffee Lake i5s with 3.8 GHz 6 core turbo, supposedly running at 65 watts? For what is a salvage part? Remember, all the good parts go to 8700Ks. Those are the best parts. And then the 8700 and then the 8600Ks. These i5 8400s are the worst hex core parts. They are the worst quality silicon in terms of performance per watt. And now Intel is giving us the base and single core turbos. So what exactly is preventing them from launching a bunch of i5 8400s which do not actually have an all-core turbo of 3.8 GHz and have something more akin to maybe 3.2 GHz, or hell, it could even be 2.8 GHz. The only thing Intel now guarantees is the base clock speed. Even the single core turbo is not a guarantee. We know this because they make us know that it is the maximum turbo frequency depending on a bunch of stuff. We just expect it to reach 4 GHz. But I can assure you, I do not expect the average i5 8400 to do anywhere near 3.8 GHz on all 6 cores. At least not on a typical i5 8400 motherboard. And here is the interesting thing, because as we know from my last video, the only motherboards currently available are Z370s, which are the high-end or the premium consumer motherboard for the Coffee Lake generation. So these are the highest quality components, the best power delivery, all that kind of thing. And all these i5 8400s, what were they all tested on? They were all tested on these premium Z370 motherboards. But if you think about the low-end motherboards, the B series and the H series motherboards, these $40, $50 motherboards, you think you're going to get 3.8 GHz i5 8400 in one of those? I really don't think so. Intel has spec'd these with a base clock of 2.8 GHz for a reason, and that reason is many of these CPUs are the lowest quality chips on the wafer that have absolutely no chance of remaining anywhere near 65 watts at 3.8 GHz all-core turbo. And this is the biggest problem here. The thing about the K-series CPUs, as we've seen in the Cinebench scores, it looks like some of these CPUs were not able to maintain the 4.3 GHz all-core turbo, but at least with a K-series CPU, you can make that choice to overclock it. We're just going to end up with higher power consumption, but presumably you're going to be sticking a really good cooler on that. Well, at least I hope so, because this CPU needs a really good cooler. So you've got your high-end CPU, your high-end cooler, and your premium motherboard, and that's quite a lot of money actually, but that's another point. At least with the K-series, if your CPU struggles to maintain its all-core turbo, due to it being a lower quality CPU, at least you can still overclock that CPU and get the performance. You can sacrifice power for performance. That is acceptable on a desktop CPU. What I think is unacceptable is these i5 8400s. When I first looked at that, I thought 6 cores, $182? That looks like a really good deal actually. And I instantly thought, this is my favourite part out of all of these. These could sell really, really well at $182. And yeah, if I thought it would do 3.8 GHz on a cheaper motherboard, then that would be a CPU that puts a lot of pressure on, say, the R5 1600. As it is, I simply don't know what I'm getting. It could be as low as 2.8 GHz, and I cannot overclock it. I am going to be stuck with whatever the motherboard guys decide, because it's a locked CPU. And you have to ask yourself, these low-end motherboards, low-end parts, they need to keep the power down. They need to assume people are spending less on coolers, maybe even using the stock cooler. What do you think the chances are of these motherboard guys setting all-core turbos of 3.8 GHz are on these lower-end motherboards? Pretty slim, I would say. All these cherry-picked CPUs sent out to reviewers, high-end motherboards. I would basically be discounting every single 8400 review that I have seen so far, because the average performance of this part on your typical motherboard is likely to be an awful lot less than what we've seen so far. Right, so I'm going to call an end to this video. I was going to talk a bit more, but I think I've covered the important parts here. You already know what I think about this stuff. You have to ask yourself, where does this end? What if that i5 8400 had a 2 GHz base clock? What would you think about that? Or imagine AMD's Ryzen R7 1700 had a 2.5 GHz base clock. What would you think about that? At least in that case, it's still an unlocked CPU, so you can always overclock it and take the extra power hit. This is a big thing for me here. These locked CPUs, this kind of crap needs to come to an end. And Ryzen should have seen the end of that. But instead, it looks to me a little bit like Intel has just conned everybody. I have to say, I admire the job that they've done. This is like Nvidia levels of marketing they've pulled off here. But I also think that one or two are just a little bit too eager to let them get away with it. And sadly, in the end, it's the consumers who suffer. Consumers end up with parts that are nowhere near what they thought they were going to get. And AMD simply needs to follow suit now. They cannot allow Intel to get away with what is effectively effectively overclock CPUs in their reviews. This multi-core enhancement crap, AMD needs to get onto their motherboard guys and say, we are now going ahead with this as well. In fact, why even not just push it to the limit? Cherry pick a bunch of CPUs, send them out to reviewers with the best quality motherboards. The only difference is they don't have this multi-core enhancement yet. But it's coming because it has to come. But look, Coffee Lake looks pretty good. Some of the parts at least look pretty good. Intel has one big advantage left, and it is ultimate clock speed, which basically comes down to maximum overclock. Some of these CPUs are hitting 5.1, 5.2. AMD are stuck at 4.2, maybe 4.3 on Threadripper. That's a big gap that they need to make up. But what Intel is basically doing is they've basically got away with these free overclock CPUs because of the multi-core enhancement thing. These CPUs are benched with an overclock, and then on the flip side, we're seeing CPUs like the i5-8400. These are being benched on the high-end motherboards and almost certainly extremely cherry-picked CPUs. If they weren't, they would not have the 2.8 GHz base clock. A little bit further down the line, a bunch of crap parts hit the market, but it doesn't matter because the reviews have already shown this part with performance that is way ahead of what the average 8400 has. So yeah, Intel played a blinder here, for sure. They have pulled off one of the biggest con jobs I have seen in a very long time. So good job, guys. So right, that's me done. Again, don't forget to check out the description below for links to Amazon, my new Amazon shop and all that kind of stuff. And of course, be sure to let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. I'll catch you later, guys.